We are pleased and honored to introduce already a seminal volume in Buddhist studies and religious studies, the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism. And as well, would like to introduce to you its two editors and authors, Dr. Robert Buswell and Dr. Donald Lopez, two giants in the field of Buddhist studies. If you can give them a warm welcome. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce to you President Morgan.
Yes, I carry this wherever I go. And not only is it intellectually stimulating, but it's part of my weight training program. On every campus, there are points of pride and there are moments of pride, and this is a moment of pride for the University of the West to have Dr. Buswell and Dr. Lopez with us. Ann and I had the opportunity to spend a few minutes with them. They are really interesting people with interesting backgrounds, and they certainly tie right in with the culture of the University of the West. They know Lou Lancaster from years ago, and they still have contact with him. So we have links. It's a small community. And I am delighted that they have taken time from their busy schedules to be with us today, to make their presentation, but also to launch this wonderful new volume. And as someone who is relatively new to the Buddhist community, I have found this already very useful. I keep it on my coffee table, and I do refer to it on a regular basis so I can better understand the history of Buddhism and the current Buddhism that we have throughout the world today. So, Dr. Buswell, Dr. Lopez, welcome to the University of the West. It is a privilege.
Thank you, Dr. Morgan. I would next like to introduce, first explain that unfortunately Dr. William Chu is not able to join us today. He's battling a very bad flu. But in his stead, we have Dr. Venerable Zhu, the director of the Institute for Chinese Buddhist Studies, who will be moderating the event. Venerable.
Thank you, Jen. I'll show you this is not a speech contest. Today we are very happy to have two giant Buddhist professors on our campus. And I think no need to give you further detailed introduction. You will already know these two professors, but still, I need to do my job, so be patient with me. First of all, I would like to introduce you Dr. Robert Buswell. And Dr. Buswell has been a long-time friend of ICBS since year 2008 when I was first here, and then he came here to give he's one of the keynote speakers in a Buddhist conference here. And also last March, he was also invited as a keynote speaker in the conference about Chinese Buddhist canon. So he now hosts the Irving and Jean Stone Endowed Chair in Humanities at UCLA. And he's also the founding director of the Center for Buddhist Studies in UCLA. And he's the editor-in-chief of the two-volume Encyclopedia of Buddhism and the author of Cultivating Original Enlightenment. And another book is The Zen Monastic Experience. I won't go on the list, otherwise you will feel that it's too long for my introduction. And the next one, our second speaker is Dr. Donald Lopez. And Dr. Lopez is the Arthur E. Link Distinguished University Professor of Buddhist and Tibetan Studies at the University of Michigan and the chair of the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. And he is also the author of Prisoners of Shangri-La and Elaborations on Emptiness and From Stone to Flesh, and among many other books. And as students of Buddhist studies, I think we're also very familiar of a lot of books that Dr. Lopez added for us. And so the topic of the lecture today will be word and lectures. And both of them will introduce the Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism. So let's welcome both lecturers.
Thank you all very much for the very generous introduction and for coming out to us today. Is this working all right? How about now? Is that better? Well, thank you all for coming out during your lunch hour to listen to us talk about the new Princeton Dictionary of Buddhism. This is a project that's been in progress for about the past 12 years now that Professor Lopez and I have been doing. We wanted to give you a sense of really what's in the dictionary, how it might be useful to you as scholars and students of Buddhism, and the ways in which you might be able to put the dictionary to use in your own teaching, in your own propagation of Buddhism, and in your own perhaps personal practice as well. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Lopez first to talk a bit about the genesis of the project. I'll talk a little bit then about the usage of the project, and then we're going to move into what we have called a top 10 list of misconceptions about Buddhism, which those of you who are now teaching Buddhism in the West will probably confront in the course of your own careers as teachers and scholars. So let me start with Dr.
Glad to be here today, and we appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be at this great Buddhist university and my first visit, so it was very memorable for me. Robert and I have been speaking over the past few days at a number of institutions. We were at UC Berkeley on Thursday. We spoke at the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco on Friday. We were at LACMA last night. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to look out in the audience today and see so many people in robes, and really to see the audience for whom we wrote this dictionary. This is a project that we've been working on for more than a decade. It was our attempt to provide as comprehensive a dictionary as possible for the Buddhist tradition. That means that we needed to provide entries in 6 canonical languages: Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. All of those languages represented there. When we have a standard Buddhist term, it's there in all 6 languages. We were asked to do 1 million words. We did 1,200,000 words, and that I think was the limit of the weight that the book could bear. As your president mentioned, in addition to strengthening one's mind, it strengthens one's body. It's very good for upper body work. So we strongly recommend the hardbound copy, although there's also a Kindle. There are many dictionaries of Buddhism, as you know, in various Buddhist languages. There are also various dictionaries in English that we relied upon. But those dictionaries tend to be specialized. For example, Malalasekara's Dictionary of Pali Proper Names, invaluable work. Sotil's Dictionary of Chinese Buddhist Terms. We have old translations of the Mahavyutpati, the famous Tibetan collection of just terminology. All of these are either Zen or Pali. Some of them are really geared much more for a general audience. And so we had to make a decision about both what would be included and also what level to write the book, at which we should write the book. And the danger of having the book at too low of a level is that it's not really a benefit to people like you. If we put it at a high level, then it's a benefit to scholars, to translators, to practitioners, and to the general public. I think for the general public, the book is one in which one finds a term that one knows. Buddha, Bodhisattva, Siddhartha, Sati, Vipassana, and one begins to read, and that will then take one throughout the Buddhist tradition by the various cross-references that we have. We've also recognized that in the development of Buddhism in America, we need so many good translators, and translators need dictionaries. Dictionaries not simply to tell them what the equivalent of this equals this, Dharma equals doctrine. We know that's a problem to make that one-to-one equivalency. But if we have a 1,000 word entry on the word Dharma. That allows the translator to have some sense of the nuances of the term and the way it's been understood in all the Buddhist traditions of Asia. So we really tried to do something that was as comprehensive as possible, as broad as possible, non-sectarian, ecumenical in a certain sense. If one is a Buddhist practitioner, all the major teachings are there. All the major famous stories are there. But the purpose of the dictionary is to make the Dharma available to all levels of people, from the scholar to the practitioner to the interested person in the general public. And we'll see how successful it will be. The first printing has sold out already. It sold out in 1 month, and so the second printing was just been done. And so we're hopeful that it will reach the audience for whom it is intended.
I think one of the major differences in this dictionary versus other previous attempts at creating a comprehensive dictionary of Buddhism is that, as Professor Lopez says, we do try to be comprehensive. We're not just focused on Chinese Buddhism or Japanese Buddhism or Korean Buddhism. We're focused really across the entirety of the Buddhist tradition. And what this means is that as one is using the dictionary, you're going to find a Tibetan term next to a Japanese term, next to a Chinese term, next to a Pali term. And it'll show, just by simply skimming the dictionary, the vast array of material that's extant in Buddhism as it has moved across these various cultural boundaries and created these new forms of Buddhism. What we decided to do in trying to figure out how to make accessible this mass of material was that if there is a term, for example, that is widely used across all the Asian traditions, these would be some of the fundamental terms of Buddhism, like a klesha, an affliction or a defilement, dukkha, suffering. Some of the basic terms that probably all of you will come across in the course of your own reading and writing about Buddhism. These terms we use as our foundational language, Sanskrit. And this was intentional. Partly we're trying to show that, that this term has a provenance that probably has its origins in India, but then is used widely across traditions in other linguistic forms. It also is intentional because I think to some extent in the West, there has been a tendency to reduce all of Indian Buddhism down to the Pali Buddhist tradition of Southeast Asia. And we're trying to demonstrate by using Sanskrit as our sort of base language for the Indian tradition that Indian Buddhism is more than simply Pali Buddhism. Pali Buddhism is an important part of Indian Buddhism, but they're not identical one to the other. On the East Asian side, where classical Chinese was the lingua franca of the traditions in Japan, in Korea, and also in Vietnam for that matter, we chose to use Chinese terms as our sort of base language. So in the West, where, for example, Japanese Zen was one of the first traditions to really gain a foothold in the United States and in Europe, I think there's been more of a tendency to use Japanese terms instead for talking about East Asian Buddhism. But I think this is very much kind of a nationalistic sort of orientation toward Buddhism. The origins of Buddhism in East Asia certainly are in China and are picked up then by the periphery traditions in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. So we decided it was more appropriate to use Chinese as our kind of base language for talking about East Asia. And then, of course, we do a similar thing with Tibetan. Tibetan is our base language for the Tibeto-Mongolian traditions. And we use Pali then as our sort of base language for talking about Southeast Asian Buddhism. We do have some terminology in Thai, some terminology in Burmese and Sri Lankan languages. But for the most part, the way you find your way through Southeast Asian Buddhism is through the vehicle of Pali. Another difference, too, is that unlike other dictionaries, and this represents what dictionary compilers bring to this process, we have things that interest us, that we wanted to have in our dictionary. We have things that we wanted to learn about, so those went into our dictionary. And we have things that we felt Buddhists and scholars of Buddhism and students of Buddhism in the West should know about. So those kinds of things went into our dictionary as well. But Don and I work in, our major areas of expertise are in fields of Buddhism that for a long time have been very much marginalized in the Western study of Buddhism. Don worked in Tibetan, started over 30 years ago, when Tibetan was very much on the fringes of Buddhist studies, was really used primarily as a vehicle for getting access to Sanskrit and Indian materials that were no longer extant in Indian languages. I have done a lot of my work in Korea, which is still very much underrepresented in talking about East Asian Buddhism. So one thing we've done, and this very much goes to our own predilections, is that we've tried to ensure that Tibet and Korea receive equal weighting to what you find for Japan or for India or otherwise. So there will be a lot of Korean terms that you will not be able to find probably most anywhere else. However, we have a very extensive cross-reference list at the back of the book. So if you know a term as a student or scholar or a monk primarily of the Korean tradition, you'd be able to go to the back index, find your Korean term, trace that back to either the Sanskrit or the Chinese term. That will be our core entry, and you'll be able to find the material on that entry by looking at it that way. If you're a student, a monk, or a scholar of the Chinese tradition, and there's a term like klesha, fangnao, which you may not know in Sanskrit, you could go to the Chinese index in the back, go to fangnao. It would take you back to the main entry for klesha in Sanskrit in the dictionary. And one final thing we do that I think is a little bit different than other previous dictionaries. I know many of you will probably have used the Digital Dictionary of Buddhism online, where you'll be able to find references to probably over 60,000 entries on Buddhist terms. That's a dictionary that's very good for finding what the Sanskrit equivalent is, let's say, for a Chinese term, for tracing what the Japanese pronunciation is of a Chinese term. But if you look at the entries in the Digital Dictionary of Buddhism, the entries generally are quite short. It'll simply give you a one-sentence explanation of what that term means, maybe a little bit longer in some cases, but fairly minimal background. What we're trying to do in this dictionary is, it becomes almost, I think, like a terminological dictionary, or an encyclopedic dictionary, perhaps. For the important Buddhist terms, we'll have easily a minimum of 500, often 1,000, or up to 3,000 words on some of these basic terms. So if you don't know what the klesha are, you'll find a complete listing of all the klesha there. You'll see how the klesha connect to the anushayas, how klesha tie into the whole notion of suffering, just the interconnections between all these terms. And these will also then take you to various cross-references to these specific kleshas, like mopa, greed, let's say, which will also have its own entry in the dictionary. So by using the dictionary and its extensive cross-referencing scheme, you'll be able to move through, we hope, the whole panoply of Buddhist doctrine and Buddhist practice. And not only in one language, but in multiple languages. So you'll be able to see not only what klesha is in Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Tibetan, Pali, but you'll also see some of the distinctive ways in which this term has been adapted. So those of you who are Chinese speakers will know fangnao, Buddhist term, actually becomes a sort of mainstream Chinese term for kind of bother and troubles, in a sense. So we talk about some of these nuances as well in the course of the dictionary. Yeah, so we thought this is a little bit flippant, especially for this audience of monastics. But since many of you are going to be teaching Westerners about Buddhism, we thought it might be interesting to take you through what we call our top 10 list of misconceptions about Buddhism. These, for the most part, are 10 misconceptions about Buddhism that you'll find in the West, especially among Western adepts and practitioners of Buddhism. But we hope we can use this as a way to kind of talk about how the dictionary can help to not only dispel some of these misconceptions, but also how it can kind of reveal what some of the underlying reasons are for these misconceptions having developed in the first place. So let's.
And these really, I think, come from our own undergraduate students. So I think that I would say that in my Introduction to Buddhism class at University of Michigan, on the first day of classes, my students hold all 10 of these misconceptions. At the end, I hope they hold none, but I'm not sure how successful I am in dispelling those. I think in some cases, some people hold these misconceptions and not others. I think we understand that none of you hold any of these 10 misconceptions. However, we know that because you're going to be teaching in America, in many cases, because some of you will be getting a PhD in which you need to talk to general audiences. It's important to know what these misconceptions are, and so rather than just talking about why these are wrong, because you all know why they're wrong, I think today we're going to talk a little about where they came from. Why do people think this? What's the history of this idea, and how can we help people to understand its origin? So, start with number.
Drum roll, I guess. So, 10 in our list of misconceptions. All Buddhists meditate. I think especially in the West, where Buddhism has been developed as something like a kind of self-help philosophy among Western adepts of Buddhism. I think there have been a lot of misconceptions about the role of meditation in the Buddhist tradition as a whole. It certainly is the case that Buddhism has an extremely extensive meditative literature. There probably is no religious tradition, certainly, but really any philosophical tradition for that matter either, which has the extensive and very detailed and terminologically grounded discussions about various stages of meditative development, about what the experiences are during those various stages, about how to employ those stages to learn to release the attachment to things which will bring about suffering. We all know this. It certainly is the case. There is a strong meditative component in Buddhism. But it also is the case, however, that throughout much of its history, it is only a very small group, and generally a very elite monks, who were actively engaged in meditation practice. In fact, even if you look back at early reading materials, if you go, for example, into the dictionary, there's a term prahanika, which is a meditative exertion, one who is practicing meditation. The prahanika were generally monks who were off in the forest. As you know how these monks lived, they had their one set of robes, they had their begging bowl that they carried, their few possessions in, like their water strainer. They had their umbrella that they used as their residence, actually. They would put a mosquito net around the umbrella and live underneath the umbrella. I've got to see it in the East Asian, or in the Thai forest traditions, several monks who still live this way in the jungles of Thailand, for example. So there has been a very strong strand of these monks, the Prahanika monks. Some of the discussions about the Prahanika, though, in Indian Vinaya literature are actually quite pejorative. They're not quite sure what to make of these men who are coming in out of the forest sometimes, rather disheveled looking with dirtier robes on, no possessions whatsoever, and really no kind of monastic grounding. They're living off by themselves as forest ascetics for the most part. And the urban monks living in Sravasti and the major urban centers of Buddhism in India really didn't quite always know what to make of these men, and saw them as rather strange, even bizarre in some cases. So there's kind of a pejorative literature about meditators in India that is not an uncommon strand of the Vinaya literature. In the case of Buddhism generally, and this is where I think it's very unusual what's been developing in the West, lay people, for the most part, were not meditating at all. Were not even instructed in meditation traditionally in Buddhism in Asia. We know this as one example. We talk about the very famous donor of the Buddha, a man named Anathapindana, a very wealthy man in Sravasti who is probably the Bill Gates of his time in India. He is supposed to have purchased the land that became the first major Buddhist urban center in Sravasti from a Prince Jeta. Prince Jeta didn't want to give up his pleasure garden, so he said, well, I'll only sell it to you if you cover the entire ground with gold coins. You all know this story. And Anathapindana does this. The land is purchased for the Buddha, and I guess partly in shame, Prince Jeta takes some small part of the wealth he just gained from selling his land to build a very fancy gate to the temple, Jetaharama in Sravasti. But Anathapindana, on his deathbed, the Buddha was not able to come to him in time, so he sent Shariputra, one of his two main disciples, to minister him on his deathbed. And during this visit, Anathapindana was given a very short sermon by Shariputra, talking about the Four Noble Truths. He talks to him about the fact that everything that is produced is subject to cessation, one of the very basic Buddhist teachings. And Shariputra gives him an instruction on Indriya Samvara, the control of the sense faculties, as a way of helping him to gain control of the pain he was suffering during that time, learning how to step back from his pain, observe it from a distance, and therefore not be so affected by it. Fairly basic strand of Buddhist practice, actually. And then Anathapindika begins to cry after hearing this sermon. And so Shariputra asks him, well, are you in pain? Is the end nigh for you? And Anathapindika answers back rather plaintively, and that's not the reason. It's the fact that I've served the Buddha for over 30 years now, and I've never once heard these teachings. And that's a quite telling comment, actually, which shows how Shariputra says, well, certain teachings are only meant for the monks and not meant for the laity. And I think this was really a very rigid distinction in Buddhism throughout much of its history. And that's where I think in the modern era we're seeing a very real transformation of the tradition. We're seeing this in the West, but this is also happening in East Asia and in Asia broadly, where lay people now are actively being brought into the practice of meditation. And certainly this is the case in the West. Just as one final example, in Korean Buddhist monasteries, there's a very rigid distinction between two monastic vocations, the Ipansum and the Sapansum, up here on the board. The Ipansum are those who are dedicated to, involved with studying principle, meaning those who are in seminary studies, studying scripture, or those who are in meditation hall, focusing primarily on meditation practice. The Sapansum are those who are involved with phenomena, meaning those who are engaged in administrative activities. And this distinction carries forward even in the Pali tradition between the so-called Gantadura, which is in the dictionary, those who are primarily scholars of Buddhism, and the Vipassana-dura, those who are engaged primarily in meditation practice. So if you look back at Korea, Ipansum, Sapansum, the monks who are engaged in meditation are probably no more than about 10% of the monks and nuns in Korea. Still a very small percentage, but I think this has probably been fairly typical throughout much of Buddhist history.
So the next misconception is that the primary form of Buddhist meditation is mindfulness. Of course, we know that's not the case, but it's interesting, I think, to think about why someone would think this. And it comes back exactly to what Robert was just talking about. The fact that in traditional Buddhist cultures, it was very, very rare for lay people to meditate at all, to receive any instruction in meditation. And in fact, when we look at this movement, this mindfulness movement, it's something that we can trace really not back to the Buddha himself as a lay practice, but only back to the early 20th century and to Burma. The British, as you know, invaded Burma and defeated the Burmese in 3 consecutive wars. At the end of the Third Anglo-Burmese War, the king of Burma was deposed and sent into exile. And when the Sangha died, he was not replaced. This was a very critical moment in the history of Burmese Buddhism. There was no king to convene a council, no Sangha to serve as the chief administrator of the Sangha. It was also the case that many of the great monks of Burma at the time, we're talking about the late 19th, early 20th century, were deeply alarmed at the British presence in their country, as they should be. And Lady Sayadaw, one of the great Abhidharma masters of the day, had studied very closely Buddhaghosa's description of how the Dharma will disappear from the world. And he noted that Buddhaghosa had explained that the first part of the canon to disappear would be the most precious, the Abhidharma. So, in fact, Lady Sayadaw believed that the coming of the British was the sign of the end of the Dharma. That it was a sign that Maitreya would be coming soon, and that something must be done to stop the disappearance of the Abhidharma. And so he came up with a very unique idea in the history of Buddhism. He taught the Abhidharma to the laity. He used a newly imported printing press to write simple pamphlets on Abhidharma, which he distributed widely. And then he did something equally revolutionary. He taught the lay people how to meditate. The idea being that the Dharma can be preserved if it's spread widely. That is, if the Sangha is somehow ends. Of course, there's no king, there's no Sangha rider. What's going to happen to the Sangha? But if the Abhidharma is found in the minds of the laity, if the practice of Buddhism is found in the practice of the laity, then the Dharma can survive. And so he taught what is really what we think of Vipassana practice based on the Satipatthana Sutta to the laity with some adaptations. And this became known in the 1940s and 50s as the Burmese method. This was then exported to Sri Lanka and elsewhere and into Southeast Asia. And this is when the hippies started traveling to India and Asia in the 60s. They learned this from teachers like Goenka. And this then became the basis of, or the precursor of the mindfulness practice that's now been turned into mindfulness-based stress reduction and things that we read about in Time magazine. So the practice that is taught as mindfulness today has a rather distant and tenuous link even back to Lady Sayadaw's time, but it really comes from this practice, this instruction of Vipassana teaching to the laity, which then spread around the world.
Number 8. All Buddhas are vegetarian. That's certainly the case here, but not necessarily the case throughout Asia. As you all know, the name for a monk in Asia is a bhikshu, and none is a bhikshuni, which literally means a beggar. Monks and nuns would go through the local village and towns to gather their food, and it was collected from whatever offerings the lay people chose to offer. I think it's fair to say that what was most precious as food to lay people was meat, and so this is what they typically would want to then offer to the monks and the nuns. And those of you who are Thai Buddhists and Burmese Buddhists here, probably still would receive meat from the offerings that lay people make to you. We know, for example, too, that if you look at the demise of the Buddha, the stories told in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta about the Buddha's death, his very last meal is offered by a blacksmith named Chunda, who gave him something called sukara muddava, which means something literally like soft pig. And we don't really know what this was. There's been much debate in the commentaries on what soft pig is, whether this is some kind of pork dish that may have gone rancid, or whether this was something that was eaten by pigs, like truffles or mushrooms. But we are told in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta that the Buddha saw this meal and told Chunda, you should offer this to me only, for only a Buddha can digest this. No one else should eat this. Whatever remains after the meal, you should bury outside. And the Buddha eats this sukara muddava and has dysentery and dies some hours afterwards. In East Asia, as I show here, the name that the East Asian come up for this sukara muddava is actually, our here means something like a fungus probably, or a mushroom of the chandanchu, the sandalwood trees. So they presume this is probably a fungus or a truffle perhaps that was eaten by pigs, was not actually meat. We know, for example, another example here is the Buddha's cousin Devadatta, who was something of a rival of the Buddha, became eventually a schismatic, tried to take over the order from the Buddha, encouraged the Buddha to retire, turn it over to him. And one of the distinctive features of his teachings was full vegetarianism. And he asked the Buddha, in fact, to require this of all Buddhist monks and nuns. The Buddha refused, saying that lay people should be allowed to offer whatever it is that they choose to offer. We should not restrict what lay people offer. The only restriction the Buddha places ultimately on meat is that monks cannot accept food from a lay. Cannot accept meat from a lay person where that meat has been killed specifically to feed that monk or nun. But otherwise, it's fair game. So this vegetarian strand in Indian religion comes actually probably originally out of the Jaina tradition. We have an entry on this in the dictionary. The Jainas were a contemporary movement to Buddha, to Buddhism among the Shramanic groups who were rivals to the broader Vedic tradition that becomes eventually Hinduism. The Jainas did have a very radical notion of ahimsa, of non-harming, which not only meant that they were full vegetarians, but also that even when they would walk around town, they would sweep the ground in front of themselves to ensure that they would not unintentionally step on an insect as they're walking around. They filtered their water very carefully before drinking to ensure that they would not drink any animals unnecessarily. So this vegetarian strand probably filters into Buddhism about 400 years later through the vehicle and the influence of Jainism.
Number 7, all Buddhists are pacifists. So Certainly we can note the important role that Buddhist monks have played throughout Asia back to the time of the Vietnam War, and I believe that this idea that all Buddhists are pacifists derives in part from that recent history. When we look at the earlier history of Buddhism, it's a much more complicated question. We know, for example, through the work of scholars like Brian Victoria, the very strong role that the Soto sect and other Japanese Buddhist sects played in supporting the Japanese Empire, beginning in the Russo-Japanese War, continuing through the Second World War. However, even when we go back to Buddhist texts, it's a complicated story. The Buddha himself instructed his monks to survive and to bear all forms of abuse, physical and verbal, that they might receive from the people to whom they were teaching. But we also know that, at least in some versions of the life of the Buddha on many of his more distant journeys was accompanied by a bodyguard whose name was Vajrapani. Vajra, of course, we know as the tantric ritual implement, but in ancient India it seemed to have meant, in some cases, just a big club. And Vajrapani means the one who has a big club in his hand. And so Vajrapani, who was a yaksha, would accompany the Buddha and to protect him. And if the Buddha asked a reasonable question to someone and that person did not answer when the Buddha asked that reasonable question 3 times, Vajrapani was there to threaten him with the club, and the person did answer after that. Vajrapani was only visible to the Buddha and to the person to whom the Buddha asked the question. Vajrapani, as we know, goes on to become a very important bodhisattva in both in the Mahayana and in Tantric Buddhism, but began simply as a yaksha. When we continue to look at Buddhist history, we see, for example, the great Sinhalese king, Duttagamani, who protected the island of Sri Lanka from the Tamil invaders, going into battle riding on a war elephant and carrying a spear, and that spear had a relic of the Buddha on its tip. Duttagamani was successful in battle, said to have killed 60,000 of the enemy, and when he called in his arhats to ask what he had done, feeling great remorse at having killed 60,000 people, they assured him that the negative karma was only that of killing 1.5 people, because 60,000 killed, there was one person who'd taken the 5,000 also refuge, the other person's only taken refuge, so that counted 1.5. This rather disturbing story is found in the Mahabharata, the great chronicle of Sri Lanka. And then there are also a number of cases from East Asia.
So we know, for example, that many Buddhist monasteries in East Asia, especially in Japan, but also in Korea and China as well, had monastic militias. This term, soe, is a Japanese term for monks' militias. And these were warrior monks whose job it was to protect the monastery from incursions either by rival monastic groups or by secular forces. In East Asian Buddhism, there's a strong strand of what we call Huguo Fujiao, the state protection Buddhism, in which the Buddhism plays an active role in protecting and guarding the national fortunes, as much through its ritual practice and its paraphernalia as through its doctrines and its meditation techniques. So, for example, if you look at many of the greatest achievements of East Asian Buddhism, such as, one example, the carving of the Korea canon in the 13th century. This was carved to create a kind of talisman that where the Dharma that was preserved in the Buddhist canon would serve to then guard or protect the nation from any further incursions by Mongols or Manchus or whoever else might be out there coming into Korea. This is not to say that they did not appreciate the teachings and doctrines in the canon, but the canon itself had protective power in its own right, and by having that canon, the state would be guarded from incursions. And we see this strand of Buddhism actively promoted and codified in Buddhist scriptures, like the Renwang Jing. This is a scripture which purports to be translated from Indian languages, but is actually written in China by Chinese for a Chinese audience, an apocryphal text. And it's in these apocryphal texts that this strand of state protection Buddhism is fully codified and articulated as well. In the Renwang Jing, rather than having Buddhas, bodhisattvas, or lay disciples engaged in interaction with their fellows, here we have kings serving as the interlocutor, asking the questions to the Buddha directly. And the kings then serve the same role in this text as bodhisattvas would. The bodhisattvas serve then in a protective orientation for the kings, but serving in a sense almost as like a sovereign of the state. So bodhisattvas and kings are in symbiotic relationship in the right teaching.
Next, number 6, Buddhism is a philosophy, not a religion. Again, something that comes up a lot in Introduction to Buddhism. And why that is, I think, is something that's worth discussing. I think it's because people think philosophy good, religion bad. And we like Buddhism, therefore Buddhism is not a religion. It's as simple as that. This really goes back to the early scholarship on Buddhism done in the 19th century, beginning in Paris and also later in London and in Germany, in which most of the early scholars of Buddhism were products in some ways of the scientific revolution and the French Enlightenment. They were rationalists and they were very strong opponents of the Roman Catholic Church, which they thought was a basis of corruption and superstition with a belief in miracles, which had no basis in science whatsoever. And therefore, when they read these early texts about a man, a prince who went out and figured out on his own, just sat down under a tree and figured it all out, and then he taught it to others who was not a god, who did not claim to be a god, who was not deified by his followers. This was something very appealing to them, and therefore they continued to describe Buddhism as a philosophy and not a religion. This is something that Burnouf, the great French scholar, says in 1844, that far back, in his seminal work, Introduction to the History of Indian Buddhism. However, I think Robert and I, as we would take our long walks in Topanga Canyon this past summer, as we were spending 18 hours proofing this thing, over the course of 3 weeks, we would talk about what have we really learned, what are the things that have been surprising to us in doing this book. One was the extreme importance of the Vinaya, the monastic code, the obsession with the monastic code in all forms of Buddhism. A second was the huge amount of wealth that Buddhist kings and emperors have given to the Sangha across the Buddhist world. And another was the huge number of miracles everywhere. And so we have here on the list the Mahasthana, the 8 great places, the great places of pilgrimage in India, each of which is a place where the Buddha performed a miracle. Among these 8 is Samkasha. Samkasha, as you know, is the place that marks the Buddha's descent from heaven. Because the Buddha's mother died, Mahamaya died 7 days after his birth, he was unable to benefit from his teaching. So after his enlightenment, he went to teach her the Dharma. Where was she? She'd been reborn as a god in Tushita heaven. Mahamaya Devaputra was her name, although she was now a male deity in this heaven. And so her son, using his omniscience, flew up to the top of Mount Meru, to the heaven of the 33, the Triatriumphia heaven. His mother, now a male god, descended to the top of Mount Meru, and he taught her the Abhidharma over the course of an entire arranged retreat. And the Buddha had to come down to get something to eat every day, as you know the story. Shariputra met him at the base of the mountain, and the Buddha, as he was on his alms round, would repeat to Shariputra what he taught on the mountaintop, and that's where we get the Abhidharma Pitaka. At any rate, when the Buddha then descended from Mount Meru, Indra and Brahma made a fabulous staircase for him of gold, silver, and jewels, and the Buddha descending down that ladder, that staircase, is one of the most famous scenes in all of Buddhist iconography. So we know these stories, right? The Yamaka Pratiharya, the great Shravasti miracle. This canon is filled with the Buddha performing miracles and also his disciples. Miracles, are they part of a religion? I guess so. And so I think we can perhaps talk about this in our Q&A, but my own position would be that however one defines the indefinable term religion, Buddhism is one.
And Don said that a lot of these misconceptions come actually from our students. And invariably, on the first day of class, when you actually say, what do you think Buddhism is? There'll be somebody in the back of the room who's going to ask you this question. What is the fat man? Every Chinese restaurant they've been to, they've seen a big fat Buddha image there, and they say, that's the Buddha. Of course not so. You all are quite well aware of this here. This is actually a man, and he was a man, a monk named Hu Dai in China in the 10th century, who went around, was apparently rather overweight, but he went around with a hemp sack that he carried, That's where his name comes from. Buddha actually means hemp sack. And so I think probably the Chinese owners of these restaurants, when people would ask, is that the Buddha? They would say, Buddha, Buddha, and they figure, okay, that's the same guy. Completely different, obviously. As he was going around his villages with his hemp sack, this is where he carried his own possessions, his food. He would pass things out to the local village children, and became recognized as something of a trickster figure in the tradition at this time. And when he died, he left a rather enigmatic verse that suggested to those who read the verse that perhaps, in fact, Buddha was an incarnation of Maitreya. Maitreya, of course, is the future Buddha, the Buddha who will restore the dispensation after the current dispensation of Shakyamuni Buddha has utterly vanished from the world. But he is now a bodhisattva living in the Tushita heaven, waiting for his time to advent. So Buddha has been connected always with Maitreya Bodhisattva, but never with Shakyamuni Buddha. So he's not the Buddha. Buddha is not the fat guy. Usually the Buddha, in fact, is the very thin man. Because one of the very common forms of a Buddhist image, as you know, is during his 6 years of asceticism, when he was eating 1 sesame seed a day, became completely emaciated with his bones sticking out. This is an image you often see of the Buddha in much of Asia. Rarely, in fact, never do you see a fat Buddha.
Next, the Buddha was a human being, not a god, and the religion has no place for the worship of gods. Of course, we know this is wrong, and one of the things we tried to do in the dictionary was to provide a very detailed description of the Buddhist cosmos. I think if you're like me, I always have trouble remembering the various divisions of the 4 concentrations of the Rupa Dhatu. So we wanted to get all those down in all the languages and to explain exactly who is reborn there, why, how long they live, and what those realms are like. And these realms are very important in the tradition because, again, as we know, the primary goal of lay Buddhists over the course of the history of Buddhism has been to be reborn in heaven, not to achieve nirvana. And when we read inscriptions in Indian monasteries found by archaeologists today, those inscriptions, often by monks and nuns, are for the good rebirth of their parents, that they might be reborn in heaven. And so when we look at the Buddhist cosmos, we see a very elaborate system of heavens, a very elaborate system of hells. And all of those are laid out in great detail. And of course, we know about the way in which Buddhism has drawn from the Indian cosmos and drawn on the Indian pantheon to bring all of these gods within Buddhism, to make them Buddhist in a certain sense, but not as immortal gods, but as simply beings who are reborn as gods and then have to become something else. And so this great moment after the Buddha's enlightenment, when Brahma comes down from the Brahmaloka and begs the Buddha to teach, this is such an important scene because it indicates that the Buddha is Devati Deva, the gods, superior to gods, greater than the gods. They must find the path on reliance of the Buddha. They do not know. And so, of course, the presence of gods in the tradition is very important.
Well, I'm a scholar primarily of the Chan and Sun and Zen tradition, and I think there's probably no school of Buddhism that has created more misconceptions than has the Zen tradition. And this is one of the very common misconceptions I think about Chan, is that it rejects all of conventional Buddhism. Its masters burn the statues of the Buddha, they scorn the sutras, and they frequent even bars and brothels with impunity because they've been enlightened to an experience that transcends all dualities, such as right and wrong, good and evil, moral and immoral, and so forth. Well, there certainly is a strong, very important trope in the literature of what is called the wuaixing, kind of unhindered practice or unconstrained conduct, where Chan monks and masters specifically claim to be able to engage in such kinds of activities without any karmic effect. There is certainly a certain strand of what we scholars call bibliophobia in the Zen tradition. The phrase buddhi ones, not establishing words and letters, where Chan claims to be based upon not the scriptures of Buddhism, but upon the direct experience and transmission of the enlightenment of the Buddha himself. That's the basis for their authority, rather than scriptures, and therefore they do not establish words and letters. What's I think quite telling, though, is that of all of the traditions of East Asian Buddhism, the tradition that has the largest body of literature is the Zen tradition. Within that literature, one important strand are what are called Jingui, the pure rules. And what these are essentially reformulations within the Chan tradition of the imported Vinaya rules of India, in a form that most directly relates to the practice and the life in East Asian Chan monasteries instead. And so it certainly may be the case that there are tropes of this rejection of conventional Buddhism literature. The reality of the lived life of Chan monks in China is very far from that trope, I think.
Number 2, the Four Noble Truths are not noble. What does this mean? This is really a mistranslation all around this word Arya. As you know, Arya, meaning noble or superior, is a technical term in Buddhism used to refer to only to the 4 Arya Pudgala, the stream enterer, once returner, never returner, Arhat. And they are distinguished, they are superior, they are above, as Arya means, above the Pratyagjana, the ordinary being, the common beings like us. And so when we read the commentary in the Abhidharmakosha on what the term Chatvadi Arya Satyani means for noble truths means, it really means the 4 truths for the noble ones, the 4 truths for Aryas, suggesting that these things are true for them and really are not so true for us. We don't understand the 4 truths and what they mean. A very beautiful example of this is given in the description of one of the 3 forms of suffering called samskara dukkata, the suffering of conditioning. The fact that we are so conditioned that we may suffer in the next moment and have no control over that fact. The Buddha says that for ordinary beings, for the Pratyagjana, the suffering of conditioning is like a wisp of wool in the palm of the hand, something very light, ineffable, something you don't even notice is there. For the Arya, the suffering of conditioning is like a wisp of wool in the eye. You can't think of anything else. It obsesses you, and all of your energy is taken toward getting it out. This is a very nice example, I think, of the way in which the most profound form of suffering is completely invisible in a certain sense to ordinary beings, but completely visible to the noble ones.
I guess I need my drum roll now, but the number 1 misconception about Buddhism, all spiritual traditions, Buddhism included, are different paths to the same mountaintop. The reality is, I think, that if you look at Buddhist authors, anywhere from Dogen in the 13th century to the contemporary Dalai Lama, all of them will assert that there's something quite distinctive about Buddhism, which suggests there's a kind of exclusivist strand in Buddhism as we see in other religions as well. When you look back into Chinese Buddhism, from at least the Song Dynasty onwards, there were very rigorous and careful evaluations of Buddhism's place in the broader religious landscape of China. And this meant that they examined very carefully the tenets and practices of Confucianism and Taoism, 2 of the other rival indigenous traditions of East Asia, and wrote treatises actively comparing Buddhism to these other indigenous traditions. Confucianism was seen as a tradition that was very close to the so-called teachings of gods and men, because it outlined the basic moral codes that would eventually lead to rebirth in heaven, or could lead to rebirth in heaven in Buddhism. Taoism was thought to have certain insights into meditative experience and into enlightenment, the so-called transcendent side of religion, but knew nothing about the other aspects of religion, about moral practice, conduct, giving, and so forth. And so it was deficient for that reason. So only Buddhism was the tradition that actually contained within it the entirety of religious experience, something other religions did not have. As time goes on, and Christianity actually comes into East Asia eventually. This is very interesting, actually. In the colonial period in Korea, for the first time in the 1930s, there's a treatise written by a Buddhist monk, very much on the model of these three traditions, syncretic documents of China, where he brings Christianity into this discussion as well, and suggests, well, Christianity is important because of its value in gaining access to the heavens again. So it's treated again as this teaching of gods and men, teaching that leads to rebirth in heaven, but it does not understand these special teachings of Buddhism focused on enlightenment itself. The Buddha, when he often taught lay people, especially taught a brand new group of people who knew nothing about the tradition, he would give them what is called the anupulikata, the graduated discourse. And this was such a common discourse that actually it's very, very curious. We don't find the whole discourse anywhere in the Buddhist canon. We have parts of it all the way through, but never the entirety of the whole discourse. And just because it was so common, there was no need to include it actually, or it would have been repeated time and time again ad infinitum. But in this discourse, he would start off with what is called dana kata, the teaching about giving, about charity. And I think this is important because we're in Buddhism, where the whole goal is kind of the radical non-attachment to all forms, all things that create a sense of self. For lay people, probably the most basic attachment we have is to our things, our possessions. And so by learning to give, to engage in charity, we learn to let go of that coarsest form of attachment. So he started with dana kata, the value of giving. He then moved on to shila kata, the value of moral conduct, of engaging in moral restraint, sensory restraint, eventually. By learning how to control the way we interact with the world at large, we're able then to develop that calmness of mind to allow us to create a more introspective focus and thus move forward in meditation practice. And he ends this general discourse with what is called svarga kata, how moral conduct and engaging in right action can lead to rebirth in heavens. Now, charity, moral conduct, and the prospect of heaven are something you find commonly in many religions. So after completing this, the text will typically say, at that point his audience's minds were pliant and receptive. And then he would hit them with the real Buddhist message. And this was the message of the four truths for the noble, four noble truths, as we just heard about. The teaching about, the very teaching that we talked in the very beginning to Anathapindada, about the fact that everything that is produced invariably will come to cessation. And then the Buddha talked about the role of enlightenment in this whole prospect. And this is what then would immediately prompt people to have this experience of entering the stream that goes toward nirvana and toward enlightenment finally. And so I think the Buddha is setting out very clearly here that even though there may be elements of his practice in his teaching that find their parallels in other religions, he himself felt that he had discovered something that was truly unique and was something that could not be found elsewhere before his time. And we also discovered,
just to add some historical background to this idea, why do we think that all paths lead to the same mountaintop? I think this really goes back to the Victorian period, the discovery of all of these new religions, and especially to the sometimes discredited theosophists who played such an important role in bringing Asian religion to the West. And of course, as you may know, Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Alcott believed that there was a deep core of mystical experience that was at the basis of all religions, and theosophy was a way of finding that in whatever religion one might study. At the same time, contemporaneous with the theosophists in India was the great Bengali saint Ramakrishna. Ramakrishna claimed to have experienced the deepest state of all religions, Christianity, Islam, all forms of Hinduism, Bhakti, Vedanta, Tantra, Buddhism, and found the experience to be identical, and it famously said that there is only water, we call it by different names in different languages. This was a very influential, a very comforting kind of view that was then spread by Ramakrishna's great disciple Vivekananda, hugely important figure in bringing Asian religion to the West in the late 19th century. The purveyor of what we sometimes call Neo-Hinduism or Neo-Vedanta. For them, Buddhism was just part of this single great religion, which it turned out was really just all Hinduism, but they didn't say that. And Vivekananda's views were very influential into the 1960s. When I think about my early studies of Asian religion, this was the time of Ram Dass and Be Here Now and all of this, which was really a form of saying all these religions lead to the same mountaintop. It's a very comforting thought. It's not a thought that's found in Buddhism.
And just as a conclusion, in the course of writing a dictionary like this, 1.2 million words, 5,400 entries, 5.5 pounds, as somebody said. We had one review that said enlightenment has now become 5 pounds heavier. I hope that's true. But, we did come across several discoveries in the course of this, and one of the discoveries was by writing the entry on one of these many hells that you find in Buddhism, the so-called Avicii hell, which is the lowest of all the hells. This is the hell. All hells in Buddhism are impermanent, like all states of existence. They all have their causes and conditions for existing. But the Avicii hell is the worst of them all because even though it's impermanent, it's still interminable. The name means interminable, actually. And there are very vivid descriptions of the kind of sufferings that go on interminably in this particular hell. But we happen to discover in the course of our writing that there is a special level of the Avicii hell reserved for compilers of dictionaries. No matter how many entries you've written, there's always one more to write. So on that note, maybe we can open it up for questions or comments if you have any. Thank you very much.